hopefully you guys are all able to hear us. We're going to start in just a few moments here. As we're getting ready and waiting for people to log on, please make sure that you've muted your microphones so that we don't have extra noise or feedback coming from all of the computers all over the state. So we'll be starting right at 1 o'clock. And if you have any technical issues, you can type them into the chat or whatever, and we'll try to help you if we can. Nikki will be off to my right here, responding to and fielding the questions and giving them to us. So if you type them into the chat, we will take several pauses throughout the presentation to answer any questions that are coming up. All right, we'll start in just a moment. So once again, remind you to mute your microphones, and we'll go live here in just a couple minutes. Okay, we're going to get started here. First of all, thank you to all of you for joining this gap funding training. Just a couple things before we start. We'll do our best we can to speak up and make sure you can hear. If you have any questions that are coming up as we're moving along, please type those into the chat, and Nikki will be helping us with those questions as we go. And also, you should have received an email that has the digital copies of the documents that we'll be referring to during the training. And they're also available now on our Free Through Recovery website, which we'll talk about at the end of the training. So one last thing, I guess, is when we move into the different policies and so forth, make sure that you understand this guidance and everything that we're giving today, especially as far as procedures, is for the state overall. And you're going to want to make sure that you reference your protocols for your agency when you're determining how to reimburse and so forth as far as gap funding. So, all right, we'll go ahead and get started. Heather is going to talk to us about some engagement strategies and motivations.
Right. I'll just take a moment and introduce myself. My name's Heather Brandt. I don't know all of you. I work for Behavioral Health Division, and I'm helping with the building of the expansion of Free Through Recovery for non-justice involved individuals.
My name's Eric Boness. I'm the lead administrator for Free Through Recovery.
All right. So like we said earlier, if you have questions as we go ahead and put them into your chat. Please make sure that your microphones are muted, and we'll go ahead and get started here. Maybe we'll get started here. All right. So some of our objectives today are to understand why there's gap funding and proper use, learn the difference between external and internal motivation, learn some tools or strategies to help link external motivation to internal, understand the role of the care coordinator and the peer support person in gap funding, learn tools for difficult conversations regarding gap funding, and then lastly, we'll be learning the new process for gap funding. Oops, that. All right, so what is gap funding? Gap funding is literally just what it says. It's to help fill a gap. So you should only be using gap funding once you've exhausted all other social service funding available in your community. As a care coordinator, you should be connecting with all of those different social services, trying to see what services they have that they can provide to your participants. And if there is no funding available to meet that gap, then you can go ahead and pursue gap funding. And that's exactly why it's there, because there are some areas that there just is not anything available in the communities. So motivation and gap funding, this is an area that often comes up. So we'll talk about it. So there's external motivators. They're driving forces that trigger you to achieve goals, whether it be your money, prizes, medals, trophies. They help motivate individuals to pursue goals. And then there's internal motivator. And I'm gonna do something here on my screen. Sorry, people. So internal motivators are forces that lead you to finish a goal for personal satisfaction or desire. It's a personal accomplishment. It's not about getting anything in return. And when I start talking about external and internal motivators, you probably have already started to label one is better than the other, right? So oftentimes in our community, in our society, we label external motivators as bad, thinking people want something in return, they want reward, they want recognition, they want money, and we start labeling the intrinsically motivated as more good and more meaningful. And what I'm going to challenge you today is to kind of normalize internal or external motivation, but how you can link that really to internal motivation. So according to an article by Terry Williams for the Nest, there are 4 intrinsic rewards that drive engagement. The first one is meaningfulness. So is this gap funding use meaningful to the participant? Is it something that they desire, or is it just of no meaning? If it's meaningful, you're going to have, it's likely going to be linked more to intrinsic motivation. Do they have a choice? The competence one can feel a little bit strange with gap funding, but does the participant feel competent in that need or area with the gap funding request? And then progress. Can the participant see progress and feel recognized? So how do we help people get to feeling better and more intrinsically motivated while using gap funding? So in Free Through Recovery, we have some external motivators. We offer transportation, housing assistance, employment, education funds, and basic need funds. And so we have a tendency to kind of label that good or bad depending on who we are in our personal experiences. So an example of external might sound like they appear motivated to sign up for Free Through Recovery to get a bus pass, or they only call me when they need something. And internal might sound more like they were motivated to sign up for Free Through Recovery as they were willing to do whatever it takes to change their lives. So what we're wanting to do as care coordinators and peer support specialists is start helping people shift from external motivation to internal motivation. So our internal and external motivation is constantly changing, right? So what do they say about New Year's resolutions? You make a resolution on the 1st of the year. Most people don't keep their resolutions past the 21st, so like 3 weeks. So here are some examples. I started eating better because I wanted to lose weight, so external motivation. But I continue to eat better as I enjoy how I feel. There was a shift from external to internal. Or there's a lot of sayings that I think in the recovery community kind of match that, right? And I don't always like to, emphasize that, but like a lot of people say, oh, you fake it till you make it, and it's just about going and getting engaged and trying something new. And then all of a sudden it shifts to something different and you're feeling more internally motivated. Or I joined Free Through Recovery as I heard they could help me with a bus pass. But they've helped me with more than I could have imagined. So I would bet that there are participants who join Free Through Recovery because they heard they could get a bus pass, or they heard they could help with work supplies, or any of those things. But those participants, that doesn't mean those participants are, using the program. That means that they started for one reason and then their motivation changed to something different. So as providers, you can really work on your mindset when you're looking at gap funding. So is there a need? Is there a purpose? Is it part of the care plan? Will it reduce a barrier? And what's the plan for sustainability? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a little bit of a role play here. And these role plays they're set up, they're not perfect. I know that conversations don't always go this way, but I wanna help give you a few strategies that you can utilize when you're in this type of situation. So, and then at the end of it, I'll kind of talk about the tools that I used here, okay? So actually, I'm going to point out some of the tools that I'm going to use here and then have you guys pay attention and listen for them. So I'm using mostly paraphrasing. So I'm using reflective listening. I'm listening to the person, but then I'm really going to infer meaning, and then we're going to explore things a little bit further, asking more open-ended questions, okay? So, all right, Eric, you're going to play a client here.
Hey, I signed up for FTR because I heard I could get a bus pass.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm glad you're here. We can definitely talk about a bus pass, but tell me more about some of your goals and how this bus pass is going to assist you.
Well, right now I'm unemployed and I really struggle with getting around without any type of transportation.
Yeah, that does sound tough. Sounds like one of your goals is to get a job. Tell me what else you're hoping to accomplish, say in the next 30 days.
Well, I really want to save some money so I can get my own place.
Yeah, well, I can see that having a bus pass is going to help you with your goals of getting a job and saving money to find a place. We're going to be talking about goals frequently, and I'll try to understand better how I can assist you with reaching them. So that might not sound like you as a provider, that sounds like me. So you can make that your own. But that participant said, you know, I signed up for free through recovery so I could get a bus pass. And there's an opportunity there to really put up a wall. As a provider, you could say something like, well, that's not what we're here for, or we're not just about getting a free bus pass. And that type of language almost infers that the person makes them feel sort of stupid, you know, makes them feel less than welcome. And so first off, I'm glad they're there. They came to me, they met at their first intake meeting, and we can talk about bus passes, but I want to explore other areas of need or risk and talk about their goals. So instead of putting up that wall, I kind of just opened the conversation there. You could use that for anything. It doesn't just have to be a bus pass. All right.
Yeah, I signed up for this program because I heard I could get a phone.
Well, I'm glad to know you're interested in programs to help you meet your needs. Tell me more about your needs.
Well, I just got out of prison and I don't have any money, no way to get a hold of my family, friends, or employers for a job. I'm supposed to stay in contact with the halfway house, but how can I do all this without a phone?
Right. Well, you're struggling with being able to communicate with those important to you. Have you thought about any short-term solutions to help you meet this need now that you aren't in prison?
Not really. I just really need a phone, and I was hoping we could go today. My roommate got a phone from his.
We can't hear you, Heather. You're muted.
Can you guys hear me again? It looks like our internet connection broke out there for a short period of time. We're good, Nikki? Okay. Sorry about that. So it sounds like roommate got a phone from his provider.
Yeah, my roommate got a phone from his provider the first day they met.
Yeah. It does sound like having a phone is important to you. However, I can't purchase this phone today without approval. And I'm not sure if we're going to be able to purchase a smartphone. And it sounds like it's a real long-term need. So what I went into saying there was that we're not going to tell providers that can't purchase smartphones. So I don't want people to think that right there. Some organizations have that as a policy that they don't purchase phones. They won't purchase a smartphone. And that's up to the provider site to decide that. But what I really want to explore here is there was a couple areas that I could have gotten into maybe a power struggle with that participant. My roommate got a phone from his provider the day they met, you know, that might be tempted to say something well, I'm not that provider. And if you're only here to get a cell phone, then you should think about a different program than Free Through Recovery. And I just want to be sure that we're sending the right message there with that, you know, we want to be welcoming and open. And if you were just getting out of prison and you had no money, you had no phone, you had no bus pass, and you heard about a program that could potentially provide those to you, you would likely sign up for them as well. So practice empathy. All right. All right. So in conclusion, you know, gap funding is useful and it does help address barriers. I've been very proud of the way that we've been able to use gap funding. It can be an external motivator, and that's okay. We need to normalize that and understand that that's normal for any type of program. However, use it as a tool for engagement and link it to internal motivation. Find out what's important to that participant and explore those. Go back to your motivational interviewing skills that some of you have. So I'm going to let Eric get into the nuts and bolts about the processes for gap funding, if there are no questions on that first part.
Any questions?
No? Okay.
Okay, well, we're going to look at more of the process here. And as I said, documents were emailed to all of you right before this training. If for some reason you did not receive those, please email our admin assistant, Nikki Sigler. That would be at nsigler@nd.gov, and she'll get those to you, and we'll make sure you get added to that master list. But those were sent out right before the training. So all of this will start, this whole new process will start March 1st. So we're going to go into some of the details here, and you'll see on your screen just the overall gap funding categories. Now we're going to break these down in just a moment and kind of go into detail, but right now I just want to give the overall picture that if a gap funding request does not meet any of these criteria that you see described here, the provider must submit this to the admin assistant for the Behavioral Health Division to approve. So if it's not here, it must be submitted for approval. If it is here on this list exactly, then you can move ahead with that purchase. And our goal in doing that was to be able to make it more easy for you to be responsive out in the field. And so we hope that that will aid. Another thing that's changed, you'll notice, is that you're going to submit this to the admin assistant. In the past, we've had those going through our administrators, and now this will go directly to our admin assistant, which is Nikki Sigler. So please make note of that, because that is a change in the process beginning March 1st. So these categories break down into the areas that you see: housing, transportation, employment, education, basic needs, communication, and clinical services. So that's a little bit of a change. Like, for instance, communication was broke out into its own category now. And then you'll also notice in the parentheses there that all of these are limited to $100 per 12-month period. So one question that may come up is, well, when does that 12-month period start? Well, for everyone right now, it's going to start March 1st. So if they were referred into the program previously, then everything's going to start, that 12-month period will start March 1st. If someone is referred later on next week, like let's say March 5th, then you will put that in as their referral date, and their 12-month period will go from March 5th of 2020 to March 4th of 2021. So that's the 12-month period that we're looking at. So we'll start working through some of these in just a moment, but let's talk first about identifying the need. Heather gave us some great input on just looking at motivations, but we also want to really address, is this a need? Is this an obstacle that is preventing them from meeting their outcomes and goals? That's one of the things that we really need to be looking at. Then we will work with the participant to determine what options they have to cover this expense. This is something that all of us do and should do in our budgeting and in our day-to-day financial management. So we want to walk with them in that and look at what they may be able to do to help cover the expense. In other words, you're kind of teaching a solutions type approach. And whether it's looking for a bus pass or whatever, or some form of transportation, help connect them with those community options and learn how to connect with them even after you might not be in the picture. They may be 2-3 years down the road and no longer in free through recovery, but they're able to connect with resources because of this process. So the number 3 on your slide there, you'll see talks about determining if they can cover a portion of their request. This is always beneficial. I mean, whether it's like, let's go back to the phone example. Let's say that you are going to try to help them acquire a phone, and instead of buying the whole thing up front, they purchase the phone and you help them with the minutes and the plan that they need. And that ownership and helping with that moves them not only towards the ownership in the whole process, but budgeting for future, making it sustainable. Number 4 there is we have to ask the question of if all options have been exhausted, then we can pursue gap funding. So we need to be looking in our communities for other resources, other things, other ways that these needs can be met, and not just turning directly to gap funding. So number 5 is especially important, establishing a plan to cover this expense in the future. We often run into this. For instance, if we're helping with something that solves the immediate need of this month, what is the plan? Have we engaged the person in a plan for how this is going to be covered in March, April, May, and so forth? And this could lead into a great discussion. Maybe they're interested in some training on budget and starting to set up an expense plan for them and managing their own finances. So the next thing we want to do is determine off of that list that we give you, and it was attached to the email that I mentioned, if the request is on the gap funding list, right? If it's on the list and the cost is less than 100 in total, then prior approval from our FTR team is not needed. In other words, you can move ahead on the purchase if it's on the list and it's less than 100. If it falls into this category, go ahead and move with the purchase. Like I said, we're hoping that this will help make us more responsive and able to meet some of those needs more quickly. What you must do then at that point is you as a provider or care coordinator must fill out and keep a copy of the gap funding request form, all of the details and so forth about other resources that you pursued and that their care plan is, that this meets and helps achieve some of the goals in their care plan. And then you want to attach to that an itemized receipt for each purchase. So some great questions came up earlier when we were doing this. When we're talking about the itemized receipts, there's a few things that we sometimes run into. You may notice, like if you're at Walmart, for instance, sometimes they'll abbreviate on the receipt in a way that we can't understand, like what was that purchase? You're gonna wanna make sure that right away you write something to the side that helps us understand and then initial it so that we know what that purchase was. Another question that came up earlier was, what if you're at Walmart, for instance, and you make a purchase that is partly in one category and part of it's in another category? Then you need to do those as separate purchases so that each receipt is specific to the request area in category. So if, for instance, you helped with some work boots for $75 and then purchased some shampoo and soap for $12, then you want to split those on separate receipts. So we'll cover some more details on that in just a moment. Now, right after you make that purchase and you keep the gap funding request form and the receipt for your records, you're also going to want to enter the purchase and into the participant category tracker. We'll look at that here on this next slide. This is a spreadsheet that you'll use to track all of your different participants that are utilizing gap funding. Now you'll notice that there's tabs across the bottom of basic needs, housing, so forth. Those are all made to read off of the first page. So if under basic needs you type Eric Boness, for instance, under participant's name, then it will transfer that name across all of the tabs. So that first row will be mine, Eric Boness, is for all of the different tabs. And so then you'll also put in the referral date. This is when they were referred into Free Through Recovery. So remember what we said now, this is all starting March 1st. So everyone who was referred in previously, their date would be March 1st there. But everyone else will, from this point forward, will have that referral date, and that's what determines their 12-month period. So yeah, old purchases that happened prior to March 1st do not have to be tracked in this spreadsheet. So there's a total on the far right over there. That amount automatically sums, so it can be used as a tool to help you keep track and make sure you're under their maximum for the 12-month period. All right. So now, if a request is not on the list, or if it's on the list but it exceeds that $100 limit, then pre-approval from the FTR team will be needed. So you would then have to submit that, as it says in step 1 there, you'll submit the gap fund request for approval, and you'll fill it out with all the details, checking the boxes and signatures at the bottom and so forth. Now you'll submit that request with its signatures to the FTR administrative assistant, which is Nikki Sigmund. So do not submit it to your regional administrator. Send it to Nikki, and she does a great job of tracking all of this stuff for us, and it'll help to have it all go to one person to speed up that process. Number 3, you need to allow a minimum of 1 week for response on whether it is approved or not, or if for some reason more information was needed. Our team will be reviewing those every week, but you need to give a little bit of time for that approval process. If the request is approved, you can complete the purchase. And then once it's completed, you do just like you did on the ones that were on the list. You keep a copy of the gap funding request form and that itemized receipt. All right, so any questions, Nikki, as we're moving along? Yeah, it was a great question. The question was, can the receipts be digitally scanned and kept for records and for audit purposes, or do you have to keep the paper copies? You're going to have to look at what your internal processes are as a provider. We have no problem with you keeping digital, but you're going to want to make sure that they're backed up somehow. So for instance, if you're saving them on a laptop, you're going to see later in the audit process that you have to retain those records for 4 years. And so you don't want to put them on a laptop, for instance, and somehow delete or lose that hard drive and not have that record, because those can be called upon for up to 4 years. So we understand we're in a digital world. If you scan those in and keep them digitally by month, that would probably be best, and then make sure that that's backed up somehow. When you send them to Nikki, to our admin assistant, we will want digitally. You'll want to send those as a PDF. So any other questions? All right, well, good. We'll keep moving along here. We'll talk about the gap funding categories and the limitations. These parameters apply to all the gap funding requests, regardless if the request is under 100 and on the list, or over 100 and not on the list. So you'll see in a moment kind of how that breaks down. First of all, let's go through each category. And you're going to see some similarities, some of these rules that apply to every category. So I'll read them the first time, and then you'll see how they're repetitive for each category. If the participant needs a stable living situation that supports the recovery, a gap funding request may be considered. Requests are limited to $100 per 12-month period. Now that's one of the rules that kind of applies across all of the different categories, is that they're limited to $100 per 12-month period. Yeah, per category. Yeah, not $100 total, but $100 per category per 12-month period. So let's look at some examples. Let's say a rental application, a utility bill, some rent assistance, or a security deposit. Those would be examples of what the gap funding could be used for. Next, let's look at transportation. There's some examples there. Transportation associated with their outcomes, such as work, treatment, education. It shouldn't be, to things that are not somehow connected with the goals within their care plan. These are limited, once again, to $100 per 12-month period for this category. And some examples is that we can assist with, let's say, a bus pass, a gas card, a bike, Uber, Lyft, or taxi. Those type of resources could be used as long as it stays under that $100 limit. Also on the bottom there, driver's license or state ID fees also fall into this category. The next category we'll look at is employment. costs associated with gaining or maintaining employment. This can be a diverse area, but we'll see items such as work boots or shoes, some specific uniform that's required for that position, or tools or supplies that are required. And that can be very helpful, especially if someone has a job that they're supposed to start Friday, they haven't gotten their first paycheck yet. We consider this to be something that can tie them over until that first paycheck is coming in. Education. Education, this should be funding the education experience that is part of the process for gaining future employment. Some examples may include textbooks or school-related supplies, training costs like a CNA course or some course that's specifically tied to their job and they're responsible for covering that, or an application fee that's necessary to enter an education program. Basic needs. This is probably one of the ones that's changed. You may notice more of a change to it than any of the other categories. Basic needs only include exactly what is on the list here. So that's probably the big change. It needs to be only the items that are listed on here. So shampoo or conditioner, for instance, if there's other different types of hair product that are needed, like I could use some to cover a couple gray hairs, that cannot be covered. And if that was purchased, then that whole receipt would be rejected. So you must make sure that everything is exactly what was on the list here. The other thing that has changed on this list is that there used to be groceries and food things on there. Those were taken off, and we must access other community resources for those, such as food pantries or whatever, to help with that need. One, too, that looks a little bit like an outlier is that last one there, fees associated with ordering a birth certificate. We kind of chuckled about that one as far as trying to figure out what category to put that in. But this is a basic need used for a lot of, needed as a second or third form of identification for everything from obtaining a job, a lease, or enrolling in an education program, obtaining some other license or whatever. So we added that to the basic needs category. All right, communication. We'll cruise through these real quick and then we'll pause for some questions. So if you have any that are coming to mind, feel free to type those into the chat window and Nikki will get those to me. So communication, we moved this one into its own category. Cell phone and cell phone minutes are in this category. Once again, we would encourage some type of shared ownership in this, like maybe the person is getting the phone and you're helping with minutes so that it can go over a couple months and help them with those communication needs. Clinical services, FTR will fund up to 1 clinical assessment per year when other opportunities for funding supports have been exhausted. So this may be a good one to staff with your administrator because there are some other programs that we're able to tap into, such as the SUD voucher and so forth for some of the different types of assessments. A question that came up earlier is what about different forms of medication? In all cases with medication, we would have to staff those. Those would have to be submitted for approval because we would have to make sure that that is a form of medication that we can reimburse. All right, let's pause for a moment. And Nikki had some questions here that are coming in. What about smartphones? Yeah, Heather used that as an example in our scenario earlier. Smartphones, that's going to be up to your internal processes. However, I'm going to go back to this communication slide. The limit is $100. So if you're able to get some basic smartphone and minutes to go with it, then it has to fall to that $100 in order for it to be a purchase that you could move on. So that may limit the types of phones that you're able to get, or if you're helping with the phone purchase, the participant may have to cover the minutes. So great questions. Eyeglasses. That one is not on the list. It would probably have to be just submitted for approval. I think we have covered some of those in the past. It's probably just not frequent enough that it was added to the that list. So if eyeglasses were to come up, then you would have to submit that for approval. Most likely, I can't speak in all cases, but most likely, we would be able to approve that. Okay, no other questions at this time. We'll just go ahead and keep moving through. So the gap funding request form, once again, the copy here is obviously kind of small. There's not a lot that has changed on this one, and it was sent to you digitally. So A few things I want to highlight here is make sure that you're giving a clear description of the request, that you're checking the box on whether the care plan is up to date, and that you're describing how this request links to the goals and the barriers that you've identified during your conversation with that participant. And remember, you're filling that out, but right below this, the participant's going to sign it. So it's a great way for you to kind of own that plan and that connection together. So the other thing that was added at the very bottom is there's a third line down there now for signature. And this was just to help with some of the internal processes that your organization may have. You're still going to have the participant signature. You're still going to have your signature as the care coordinator, but now there's also a place for a fiscal administrator. So if you're a larger organization where all gap funding requests go through one person and they need to be able to sign off on it, then that's what that line can be utilized for. If you're a one-person shop and you're both care coordinator and fiscal administrator, then you can just sign twice. Yes. So, okay. Questions? No, we're good. All right. Well, let's talk about reimbursement. This is probably where the process really starts to change here compared to what we've been doing. We used to have you send those in kind of one at a time, attached to an email, and this is going to change for starting March 1st for the month of March. Now the provider will submit the gap funding monthly reimbursement form to the FTR admin assistant by the 15th of each month. So as you're accumulating all of them for the month of March, you will need to submit that to Nikki, our admin assistant, no later than the 15th of April. So you'll have a couple, a week or two to kind of get everything compiled on that list and then submit it for reimbursement. Here's another thing that has changed, point 2 or bullet 2 there. All purchases must be submitted within 60 days of the purchase on the receipt. Otherwise, the purchase is not eligible for reimbursement. So we can't have receipts coming in 3-4 months back. They have to be turned in within 60 days. Then the provider must add this purchase and the category to that participant category tracker. So you want to make sure that you're not only putting it on your overall monthly reimbursement form of all reimbursements for your providing agency for that entire month, you're going to also want it put under that, on that participant's row so that we can track their limits in each category. So here's a picture just kind of what that monthly reimbursement form will look like. You got the participant's name, their SID number, brief description of the request, and the amount. So all of your participants for that fiscal month that you have done gap funding for will all need to be listed there, the description and the amounts, and then it totals at the bottom of the sheet. And that's the one you will submit just this sheet to Nikki each month. You will retain the copy of the receipt and the gap fund request form in your records, and you will just submit this one sheet to Nikki by the 15th of the month. Any questions on that so far? All right, we're doing well. So let's talk a little bit about transferring participants. What happens, I'll just use 2 of our providers as an example. Let's say Lutheran Social Services have been serving a participant and they've had a couple gap funding requests, and now that participant is transferring over to all of us in recovery, Lighthouse Church, something like that. They're transferring to a new provider. Here's what we'll need to do. We will transfer the history through the FTR administrator, because continuing the dialogue about that participant and so forth for time after the transfer has taken place, that isn't covered in the releases. So we want to make sure that we handle it through the right channel. So using that illustration, if LSS was serving the person and had the history for Eric Bonas, let's say, and all of the gap funding, and now that participant transferred over to All of Us in Recovery, then All of Us in Recovery would call their administrator or email them and ask for the history on that participant. And then the administrator would contact LSS and say, I need the history for such and such participant, and they would transfer that. Because the history goes with the participant, it does not reset when they transfer to a new provider. So once that was transferred, you would enter it on your form and continue to track it from that point. Okay? All right. So let's talk a little bit about the audit process. The Behavioral Health Division will complete periodic audits of the gap funding requests and reimbursements. Now, notice I said periodic audits. I just want to kind of warn you up front or let you know, we're going to audit pretty much everyone for the first couple months so that we can help with just TA and make sure everyone's kind of getting this new process right from the beginning. We don't want to get 3-4 months down the road and realize there's something we could have corrected early on. So if you get called like the first 3 months, you're kind of like, I thought this was going to be periodic. Why is Nikki picking on me? That's not what's going on. We're going to be working as a team for the first couple months to just help this transition go as smoothly as possible. So the provider, and when we're ready for an audit, the provider will be notified by the FTR administrative assistant, which is Nikki, that they have been selected for an audit. And when Nikki does this, it may be just 1 month, it may be 3 months. It could be multiple ones, an audit period that is chosen. At that point, the provider must submit the gap funding request forms and the correlating receipts and with the gap funding monthly reimbursement form that was called for. So I'll use example, if Nikki called in April and said, hey, we need your March, we're gonna audit your March gap funding, then you would need to send the cover sheet, kind of would be that monthly reimbursement form, and then behind it, you'd wanna have all of the gap funding request forms and their attached receipts that exactly match, okay? So you will submit that along with the participant category tracker so that we can see not only all of your expenditures, but expenditures for a particular participant, okay? And you would submit those to Nikki and those will be audited. One thing I'll make note of, and I already referred to this when the great question came up about digital versus paper. Your records need to be retained for 4 years because in audit processes with the state, we could be called upon for an audit of a previous biennium, a previous 2-year period. So we need to be able to go back up to 4 years in order to pull those records. So please make sure that you retain all of those for 4 years. Any questions that have come up so far? All right, well, let's go into the audit process then. During an audit, the division will review your monthly reimbursement form and match all of the gap funding request forms and receipts. So we will make sure that everything matches exactly. And if so, everything looks good, then you pass the audit and Nikki will notify you. And I don't know if she'll send a little, smiley face or something you can put up on the fridge. We'll see. But so you'll pass an audit if all the expenditures match exactly. So if there are any items on the receipt, I already mentioned this, but if there are any items on the receipt that are not approved, then the entire receipt will be rejected. And the provider will be responsible for reimbursing the division within 30 days of when we notify you for the entire amount of the receipt. So I'm going to use this as an example. Let's say you go to Walmart with the participant and you're picking up some of the stuff on the basic needs list and the total comes up to $55. And then you're standing in line and you decide to grab a Mountain Dew. Hey, been there, done that. Walmart kind of sucks the life out of me too, and I sometimes need a Mountain Dew. But you're going to need to do that as a separate expenditure and keep that, because if it's on your Walmart receipt and that's not pre-approved, that entire $56, $57 receipt would be rejected and you would have to reimburse the division for that full amount. So that's just one example. Many times what I do, if I'm doing a job working as a contractor or whatever, I'll go through, I'll tell the person right at the register, this needs to be 2 separate orders. And I just do the stuff that's covered and do the other as personal. So if the provider does not pass an audit, the gap funding services will be suspended for that provider until the discrepancies are reconciled and settled with the division. Now we will work quickly with you to get those settled. We don't want participants, suffering somehow because of that suspension time. But they will be frozen until we're able to reconcile. So maybe it means that something was missing, you get that to us. We might be able to lift that day if we're able to verify what was missing and we get things reconciled. But if you spend any during that suspended time, then you as a provider would be responsible for that. We will not reimburse. So larger organizations, you'll want to figure out kind of how you're going to notify if for some reason stuff, if privileges were suspended. So not passing an audit may result in gap funding services being suspended indefinitely. So it's one thing, like I said early on, we're going to be extending grace and trying to help navigate through it or get things corrected as soon as possible. But if someone is continually spending outside a category or not matching receipts, they could be suspended indefinitely for that provider. And then obviously worst case scenario is at the end there, and I hope we would never have to navigate this, but abuses of gap funding or any evidence of fraud may result in discontinuing the MOU with the provider. So fraud or misuse could lead to an FTR provider their services being discontinued, them no longer being able to serve as an FTR provider. So that would be obviously worst case scenario, and we hope that would never happen. Any other questions that are coming up? All right, we're good so far. Well, Heather's going to wrap up here with kind of a summary of what's new, and then make sure you're sending in any of your chat questions in these last few minutes.
All right, so, you know, we just talked about what's new, and as I kind of sit here and review with you all, pretty much everything is new. But the gap funding list is different. You should spend some time looking at that as a provider, and we will keep the most updated gap funding list and guidance on the Behavioral Health Division Free Through Recovery website. So if you go to that website and look at, like, it's under becoming a provider, then there's the provider guidance MOU, it's going to go in there. So you should, Eric will also send an email whenever that's updated, but if you're looking for that form and wanting to make sure you have the most up-to-date copy, you should look there. It's now really your responsibility as a provider to keep track of your gap funding requests and receipts. You don't send them in as you receive them to your administrator like you currently do. You're going to use that tracker and submit them by the 15th. And so that's new. And you'll also have to come up with an internal policy or procedure on what you're going to do with those requests to have them so they're available for those audits. And then the new thing, yes, we will be facilitating periodic quality assurance audits. So we encourage you to ask questions. We encourage you to reach out if something's unclear. We would rather that we do it that way than an audit come and you caught by surprise. So please be reaching out, please be asking questions, and we will be working very closely with you. And then lastly, if the provider's not following policy, their ability to use gap funding can be suspended. And so we want you to be using this policy as a guidance and following policy. And so anything not on those lists needs to go to Nikki as a request for approval.
All right, any final questions that you have, please send those into the chat real quickly here, and we'll try to respond to those. As Heather mentioned, reach out to your administrators, any of us, if you have any questions. We're glad to help navigate through this change. We really think that this is going to help with efficiency and being more responsive out in the field, and the motivations that Heather highlighted at the beginning. You know, gap funding can really be an amazing tool for our program. So thank you for all of you who have helped in the last year as we've been learning and navigating this together. And we appreciate all the work that you do in serving our participants in Free Through Recovery. Thank you. You got a question? Oh, barely.
Oh, no, I'm just.
Yeah, the question was, what happens if you miss the 15th deadline?
So you should be making accommodations within your organization to meet that deadline. If that means that care coordinator is going to be gone, you should be submitting it early to Nikki. You only have 60 days from data, you know, to be submitting those purchases. Otherwise, they're not eligible for reimbursement from us.
Yeah, part of me would like to say, well, we can't really flex on that too much, is all I can say. You know, we hope that won't happen. That deadline needs to be firm. We've talked about that in several areas of the program right now with, you know, 1,300 plus participants and 40 plus providers, 220 care coordinators active in the state. We have to hit those marks in order to manage the program well. So please make sure you hit that 15th deadline, or it could be possibly not reimbursed for that month. So. Okay, right, question came, we'll reinforce of what we're to do if they're not on the list or they're over $100. If they're not on the list and they're over $100, then you fill out the gap funding request form and you submit that to Nikki, and that our FTR admin assistant, and that would go to the committee for approval. So yeah, if there's something like, let's say, for instance, on that basic needs list, you're at Walmart and there was really something you thought you should get, do not purchase it and expect to, you know, then submit it for approval. Anything that's not on that list, you would have to submit for approval first. So, oh, handling rent.
Yeah,
Okay.
the question about rent. Yeah, we're aware that a lot of times $100 isn't enough to cover those rent requests, but we also want to be aware that we want to be screening those and be consistent with how we implement that across the state. So those do go to the gap funding committee, which is a group of us that discuss those, and so that would need to go to that committee through Nikki.
The nice thing about this guidance that we're giving is that, sure, there's some firm rules on like the $100, max without approval, but it still does give us the ability to be person-centered. So we can do that, but those would have to be submitted. So if it would help, and the $100 is going to help them move ahead, and they can come up with the rest, then you're able to move right away. Otherwise, submit it to us for approval.
One thing that also we didn't address at all through the training was emergency gap funding requests. And we want you as care coordinators to really be distinguishing whether that is a true emergency or not before submitting it that way. So, and why did that become an emergency is also something that we need to be addressing. So, if it's a rent emergency, if you're meeting with that participant every 7 to 10 days, sometimes it's unclear to us as a committee, like maybe the client didn't communicate that to you, or what happened, like how did we get here is sometimes a question that we have as a committee. So think in those contexts when you're submitting your request.
Great questions. Any others? All right. Well, as we said, if questions come up as you're reading through this stuff and processing, especially in the next couple of days, once again, this is going live March 1st. But if your work week is Monday through Friday, by the time you come in Monday, this will be the new process for next week. So if anything comes up, our FTR administrators are available to assist with questions. So email, call us, whatever, and we will help navigate this. Thanks again.